I've saved my progress as initialhousegrid.ai, and in this exercise, I'm going to pass along a few tips and tricks for working with perspective grids because there's a heck of a lot of bells and whistles going on here, and there's a few top secret hidden tricks as well. Now, I've set up my grid, it's visible on screen, and I've selected the Perspective Grid tool. Now, note that you can hide the grid at any point in time when one of the Grid Savvy tools is selected. So that is to say, if the selection tool is active, which is not a Grid Savvy tool, and you try to click on that little close box above the widget, nothing happens. It just ignores you. And that's ridiculous, in my opinion, but that's the way it works. However, if you switch to one of the Grid Savvy tools like the rectangle tool, and then you click on the little close box, then the grid goes away. As soon as you click on the Perspective Grid tool, which is also, of course, Grid Savvy, so you can click the close box with it as well. But as soon as you switch back to the Perspective Grid tool, the Perspective Grid comes back up on screen. And I was telling you, you can also go to the View menu, choose Perspective Grid, and choose this command to hide the grid or show the grid. Normally, it has a keyboard shortcut, and I apologize for this. I stepped all over it with D keys. By default, it's Control-Shift-I or Command-Shift-I in a Mac, but I went ahead and reassigned that keyboard shortcut without really thinking to the inverse command. So if you don't like that, then you can go over here to the Edit menu, choose Keyboard Shortcuts, dig your way to that Hide or Show Perspective Grid command, and go ahead and reassign the keyboard shortcut of Control-Shift-I, Command-Shift-I in the Mac to it. Anyway, I really don't find the shortcut to be necessary because, after all you have to do is click this close box in order to hide the grid, switch to a different tool, switch back to the Perspective Grid tool, and then it comes back up on screen. The other thing to bear in mind is that you have one and only one perspective grid per document. So I don't care if you've got 15 artboards all over the place, you've got one perspective grid. If you need a different perspective grid for each of your artboards, guess what? You're going to have to put them in separate documents. That's just the way it is. Also, the perspective grid is not like a guideline. It doesn't exist on a specific layer. You can't hide it and show it and lock it from the Layers panel. And so basically, you've got this one grid that exists independently of all of your layers. I was telling you about how these panes right here can end up getting foreshortened. And what we're seeing is a very long left-hand pane and a very short right-hand pane. Even though I've dragged this knob way out here, I'm just not getting any more grid action. And that's because Illustrator isn't able to render the grid at this resolution. And the idea is that if Illustrator had to pack in too many trajectory lines, the ones that are extending to the vanishing point, and vertical grid lines, then the grid would end up being opaque at a certain point and you wouldn't be able to see your artwork. It doesn't matter whether you can see much of this pane or not. You can draw on the pane all the way to the vanishing point and way beyond in front of the pane as well. So it's just a visual guideline. But you may feel like you want more of a pane, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But first, let's say that the grid is too opaque for your taste. You want to make it more translucent. Well, in that case, you go up to the View menu, you choose the Perspective Grid command, and then you choose this command right there, Define Grid, a hard command to get to, but pretty useful when you're setting up the grid in the first place. And at that point, you can change that opacity value. And I'll go ahead and take it down to 35%, let's say. You can change the colors of your various panes to your heart's content. That's about all I do inside of this dialog box other than save a preset, which we'll do in a moment. You can also change your grid resolution here if you want to numerically, as opposed to just dragging that little diamond-shaped gadget on screen. And if you're Mr. Science, then you can work with these values right there. But I just go ahead and adjust the grid manually on screen. At any rate, I'm going to click OK in order to make those grid lines more translucent as you're seeing them there. But let's say you don't want any grid lines. You just don't want to see them at all. Well, check this out. This is the wackiest technique. Notice that we've got these little knobs right here, and there's 3 of them all together, and they look like little circles inside of circles, perhaps wheels. One of them, this guy right there, controls the ground plane, so you can drag that plane up or down if you so desire. And then the other 2 allow you to swing those left-hand and right-hand panes. But notice that they're not color-coded, which I think is really odd. I'd like to see this one be green and this one be orange and this one be blue, for example. Well, you can do that plus more by Alt-clicking or Option-clicking on a Mac. So if I Alt-click or Option-click on that little control right there, then I end up switching from the grid to a translucent pane. And I also get a color-coded marker. Why isn't that the default, at least for the marker? And then, if you Alt-click or Option-click again, you'll totally get rid of that pane. And all you've got is this line, just one line extending back to the vanishing point. If you want to restore your grid, you Alt-Option-click again. And then if you want to go back to the translucent overlay, you Alt-Option-click once again, a third time in my case. Now I'm going to do the same thing for the other ones. I'm going to Alt-Option-click on this guy in order to create a translucent right-hand pane as well as an orange marker. Very handy. And then I'll Alt-Option-click on this one in order to establish a translucent green ground plane and create a green marker. Having done that, let's say that this is my ideal perspective grid, then you want to go ahead and save it by going up to the View menu, choosing Perspective Grid once again, and then choosing Define Grid. Notice that I'm not showing you any right-clicking techniques because they don't exist. Anyway, I'm going to go ahead and choose Define Grid, and I'll click on Save Preset, and I'm going to call this Favorite House Grid, let's say, because I've got a couple of others set up. And then I'll click OK, and now I have this house grid, and I can come back to it anytime I like. I'll click OK in order to hide the dialog box, and now you'll notice here in the View menu, if you go down to Perspective Grid, you'll see 2-point perspective, and there's Favorite House Grid. And now another thing to note is that these settings are not saved along with your document. Rather, they are saved as global preference settings, which means it's easy to lose them. If Illustrator crashes, which happened to me before this exercise actually, then you'll lose any grids you saved during that session. So it's one of those things, if you really want to preserve that grid setting, then you want to go ahead and save your changes, of course, but then go ahead and quit the program and restart it. And that is my random collection of tips and tricks for working with the perspective grid here inside Illustrator.